This program is underwritten in part by Bolt Nagy, attorneys at law, and viewers like you. The views expressed on this program are not necessarily those of WTJX, its board, staff, or underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to the first open panel discussion hosted by the Virgin Islands Bar Foundation. This presentation is part of the VI Bar Foundation's efforts to encourage a more informed community and in turn improve access to justice by each and every citizen in this community. I am attorney Venetia H. Velasquez, a practicing attorney for more than 18 years. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees for the Virgin Islands Bar Foundation and chairperson of its Community Outreach Committee that brings you this program. I will be your moderator this evening. Joining me on this evening's panel are Attorney Trudy Fenster, an attorney in private practice for 14 years and a former president of the Virgin Islands Bar Association. Attorney Fenster serves as the inaugural president of the VI Bar Foundation. Emil A. Henderson III has been a member of the Virgin Islands Bar for 18 years and is the managing attorney at the law offices of Yvette D. Ross Edwards, where he practices civil and criminal law. Most recently, he served as the chief legal counsel to the governor of the Virgin Islands from 2015 to 2019. Genevieve Whitaker, JD, a community activist who holds a Juris Doctorate from Stetson University College of Law and a Bachelor of Arts in Government and World Affairs from the University of Tampa. And attorney Kevin Rames has been a member of the Virgin Islands Bar Association since 1985. Kevin is the owner of Caledonia Communications Corporation, which owns and operates the seminal news talk radio station WSTX AM and conscious reggae station WSTX FM in the Virgin Islands. Kevin attended Brown University and the National Law Center, George Washington University. I hope you find this discussion stimulating and informative, and I invite you to join the discussion by calling 340-718-3339 as the phone lines open up. Our topic for this evening is free speech, free press, free society. The First Amendment, of course, provides 5 important rights. The first of these rights is the right to free exercise of religion, the right to free assembly, the right to petition the government for grievances, and perhaps the most important or the most notable of these rights is the right to free speech and the right to a free press. We will focus today primarily on the right to free speech and to a free press in ensuring that we continue to live in a free, democratic society. Now, I'm going to turn to the panelists this evening and ask, well, when we talk about free speech and free press, what does that mean to you? What does that convey?
Well, it definitely conveys the notion that our founding fathers had, that we should live in a society where we are able to express our thoughts, our ideas without retaliation or retribution. And individual rights, which is the individual's free speech, comes from that wholeheartedly. But when we talk about free press, the importance of having that free press to be a checks and balance on government, I believe, is one of the most paramount of our rights that our founding fathers put together. So for me, those are the 2 components that I think really lists out what we need, what the founding fathers wanted, and which is why it is the actual First Amendment. The first thing they dealt with was the issues regarding the speech and the protection of the press.
And I think it's quite fundamental to the to democracy. I think it's quite fundamental to not only the exercise of our freedoms, but also the existence of our freedoms in the first instance. The idea that you can, actually stand up in the public square and explain yourself, explain your own political position or your own religious convictions or your own, approach, to the development of society, without fear of being arrested or fear of being somehow sanctioned by the government, I think is absolutely critical. And I think that extends to the press as well. I mean, the press is a check on government, as Attorney Henderson indicated, and it's critical that not only that the press, first of all, be responsible, but second of all, obviously look into, freely and openly look into, what happens in government, being able to report on it, and be able to tell people, in the general public, what is happening, in the sometimes obscure halls of power.
And I think that when you look at, in terms of people speaking out, that's people organizing, from the perspective of, even within the context of our issues, of where we are now as Virgin Islanders, because while we weren't really thought of when, of course, the U.S. Constitution was actually enacted, here now in the Virgin Islands, how do we bring that home? How do persons become more engaged politically? As we know, recently when Puerto Ricans expressed their freedom of speech in calling for the resignation of their governor for corruption, when we look at ways in which people organize, come together, and express themselves in even the highest forms. And with that tied to the press, many, we look now to social media, and as a young person, as a millennial, we know that the power of the voice, even through this even new media, through social media, and pushing for change, and another expression form that has to be protected.
Now, when I'm
if
sorry.
I might just add, I think the beauty of a democratic society is that we have these linchpins that allow us to have and exercise certain freedoms. And when you compare a democratic society to a communist society, you can see the differences. As Kevin said, you can talk about what your government is doing. You can ask for information from your government. We rely on the press to get information from us, the public, and inform us in ways that we could not as individuals do. So I think it's really important that we recognize the freedoms that we have in a democratic society, of which the free press and free speech are two of those linchpins.
And if you don't use it, and if you don't use it, first of all, and if you don't protect it, second of all, it has a tendency to go away. I mean, when you're in government and you're exercising power, and have no doubt about it. I mean, when you're in government, whatever level of government you are at, whether you're at the highest levels of government or you're a government bureaucrat sitting in an office, you are exercising power over the lives of people. Okay, and a lot of times they want to do that. Government people want to do that in private, want to do that in secret, want to make those decisions and not be called on the impact of those decisions. And that's why a free press, I think, is very, very important, because the free press allows you to investigate what's going on in government and to report on what's going on in government. And of course, your rights to free speech give you an opportunity to speak about that, speak about it clearly without fear of retaliation. And what we found,
the foundation of that is that the press is not there for the press' sake, but that the press is standing in place of the people. And so you're actually there to report on behalf of the people.
No doubt about that. And of course there are limitations on free speech, as well as there are limitations on press power, the right of the press to report on what goes on in government and outside of government. And what we find is that the law is very dynamic in this regard. The law is developing as things like social media develops, as things like challenges to press freedom or challenges to free speech develop. And there are some baseline cases that are out there, that talk about the limitations on, say, free speech. I mean, everybody knows the phrase, "You can't yell fire in a crowded theater." Everybody knows that phrase. I mean, there are limitations on free speech, and one of the key limitations on free speech is the Brandenburg case. That is Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is a 1969 case that essentially says that if you're inciting someone to violence, or you're inciting someone to take lawless action, and that lawless action is highly likely, and that lawless action is also imminent, then that speech is not protected. So the Brandenburg test is imminence, lawlessness, and a likelihood that that speech might end up, with some sort of violence or lawlessness. And so
why do we
yes.
believe that, looking at the Brandenburg case, why are limitations important, and why is free speech not absolute, given the apparent absolute statement in the First Amendment? Why do we need these limitations on free speech?
Well, we definitely need these limitations because while people have a right to express themselves, to protest, we have seen, we have world examples. We even have examples within, the U.S., examples here where we have to also at the same time in a democracy protect the rights of others, because expressions can lead to, and violence can lead to unintended consequences for persons being assaulted. But at the same time, I have to say that there have been times in our history which shown that free speech, and it may have been violent, or that in the sense that people are fighting for their rights. So at times we can get pretty close there to, but it's striking that balance, being able to say, well, what you say may be, in the case of fighting for human rights, there comes a time when you have to fight, and sometimes that fight may lead to something, may lead to violence. So it's a balancing, because at the same time, we look to what just happened, right, Sister Island. There were, while it was mostly peaceful, there were some acts of where the police had to intervene. And when we look at various protests, we know that there's a police presence. So it's a balancing act, and sometimes it does get to that point, pushing the limits of
right. And
freedom.
just to if I might, just to add to that, tyranny comes in all forms, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And so while we're giving people the freedom to express, when it comes to the point that your speech becomes harmful to others, then there needs to be a check on that speech, right? And so the idea that you can speak out against the government, you can protest, you must do so responsibly. And to do so responsibly, you cannot incite others to riot, for example. You cannot advocate for overthrowing the government, another example, right? So there are checks, and it's necessary in every democratic society, because you cannot have it absolutely.
I think it shows that interpreting our Constitution is fluid, in that as our society changes, our interpretation of what our founding fathers meant changes, which is kind of odd, because we have some justices who call themselves strict constructionists or strict interpreters of what the Constitution says. And you just asked, Phoenicia, where you said, it seems it's absolute as our founding fathers wrote it. But what's interesting is all of these limitations came from interpretations of the court, not what is actually in the documentation. So if we were to really strictly read our Constitution, it would mean that you can say whatever you want, wherever you want, however you want, and no one can do anything to you. But we've carved out certain exceptions to that, primarily because we don't want the government overthrown. We don't want to incite violence through fighting words, even to this section of pornography. We allow pornography for adults, but we don't allow it for children. That's not a protected speech. And so a lot of those are interpretations that has come along through our development as a society. But it's very interesting that you said, how do we, reconcile that? Because our Constitution says you have the freedom of speech. And it's clear, it doesn't have any limitations on it.
And isn't that interesting, not just for the First Amendment, but for all of the amendments that govern our society? Isn't it important for us to realize that a document written in the 1700s could not possibly have contemplated all of the social structures that we have today, and so we rely on judicial interpretation, primarily through the United States Supreme Court. And so when we look at the Brandenburg, and we look at the Chaplinsky decisions, how do we, and that's where the fighting words doctrine comes up, and all of the limitations that Kevin just outlined, how do we then balance that against limiting the government from taking actions against speakers based on how the crowd may be reacting, for example, as what happened in the Bible Believers case? So how do we balance the two public interests?
Well, I think it starts to a certain extent. I think it starts with judges, having an appropriate respect and regard of the of the laws and of the Constitution, and also of the history and how First Amendment law is developed. Judges. You talk about the Supreme Court. Having obviously a key role in setting the general parameters for the theories of free speech or theories of free press, but it's really the judges, even at the Superior Court of the Virgin Islands and the District Court of the Virgin Islands, that ultimately make these decisions in the first instance, and they have to, essentially, first of all, respect precedent, and second of all, recognize when precedent doesn't match up, with the situation that you found yourself in, and that maybe there's an opportunity there to develop new law, either with respect to additional restriction or with respect to additional freedoms. And so I think that there's been a number of defamation cases in the Superior Court. I've taken 3 defamation cases to a jury, one to summary judgment, one very recently, that I lost that I thought I should have won. But ultimately, yes, of course, ultimately it is juries in the territory who have to respect the law. Juries in the territory, in the states, who have to respect the law, understand the law, listen to the instructions that the judge gives you, and the judges who look at the wide range of history and how history is shaped by things like the Constitution and statutes that came out of it, and essentially everybody is required to act responsibly in the interpretation of the law, so that ultimately, when the structure is developed, it's developed in conformity with basic constitutional principles.
Right.
And I think keeping responsibility, because here we have, when we speak about the press, the responsibility of persons, radio show hosts, the responsibility of the newspaper to, in fact, investigate the facts. In fact, when they relay news, we have battles on the national level with different news media. Some in many arguments to say promoting propaganda. In other words, their statements unsupported, or even within the radio land. We know we heard about Rwanda. What happened? It was to the radio, where violence, where likely that was in a case before the Supreme Court, it would have the government itself would be held liable, and so what we look to now is how do we in many ways ensure that and push for our own even radio show hosts and for our news media. So here in the Virgin Islands, we have a number of news mediums. Sometimes stories come out and people comment, but in some cases maybe the facts aren't clear or the facts aren't brought out correctly. So it's really about the professionalism within, of course, the whole parameter of being a journalist. I remember a case that actually when I served as a law clerk, and we talked about the Kendall case, in which there was questions even in some of the witnesses brought in, where even some of the reporters who, how they were reporting the stories and things like that in the daily news. So if you look at it, it's about really putting the responsibility on also the journalists and the news media themselves.
But let me ask you this to kind of switch it up a little, because freedom of the speech is not limited to what comes out of our mouths, is it? Mm-hmm. So what other expressions? I mean, recently we've had examples where Colin Kaepernick expressed himself by kneeling and suffered some economic consequences as a result. We had a recent decision from the United States Supreme Court just a few weeks ago where there was a challenge because the state was prohibiting, actually an office, prohibiting the litigants from using or trademarking the term fucked, F-U-C-T, because of its apparent obscenity, and the United States Supreme Court said you can't do that because we have the First Amendment. So what types of expressions are protected under the First Amendment?
Well, it really depends on where those comments are directed. I mean, there are and what the general circumstances are that you're addressing or that you're focusing on. Counsel Whitaker, Attorney Whitaker, just recently mentioned the Kendall case. That's Judge Kendall of the Superior Court took issue with a series of stories in the Daily News. And that series of stories concerned how he treated alleged perpetrators of domestic violence. It was alleged that he would not give them bail, that he would let them go in their own recognizance and they would reoffend. The Daily News essentially wrote story after story about that, and then one gentleman by the name of Saldana, offended in that fashion, was released on no bail and then went out and committed a murder. And the Judge Kendall, reading the stories in the Daily News, said, you, the Daily News, are implying that I had something to do with the death of this child, and I did not. I essentially, in the context of my judicial function, I determined that this person was appropriate for bail, and he was let out. And what he did when he was out on bail is a crime that he committed. And so, you, Daily News, implying that I had something to do with this murder, was essentially violating my rights, defaming me. And that case essentially turned on the same issues that were brought up in the United States versus, New York Times versus Sullivan, which is a very, very famous Supreme Court case on the issue of freedom of speech. The New York Times versus Sullivan case said that if you are a public figure or you are a public official, that even if a story is inaccurate about you, as long as that story is not written with actual malice, it is not actionable. You cannot sue someone and recover money for that. And actual malice means that the writer has to either know that what he is writing is false, just know it, and you can prove that he knows it, or he has reckless disregard for the truth or falsity of what he is writing. And what was interesting in that case is that when the jury came back after hearing these instructions from the judge about actual malice, about knowledge of falsity, the jury came back and gave Judge Kendall, I think, $250,000 for something like that. And then Judge Edgar Ross, in the exercise of his authority as judge, overturned the jury in what's called a judgment notwithstanding a verdict, and essentially eliminated the jury's verdict by saying, this is a public figure, you did not prove that the Daily News reporter had actual knowledge of the falsity of what she was writing. And so what you see there is you see both sides of it. You see the constitutional principles in New York Times versus Sullivan. You see the application of those principles in court. You see a misunderstanding of those principles by the jury, and then you see the application of those principles by the judge. Yes.
So the distinction.
I'm sorry, but before we go on, I want to remind the listening audience that we will be taking calls shortly, and so I'm going to encourage you to call 340-718-3339. And Trudy, and then I'd like to hear from the other panelists. So, and as you're discussing that, why do you think the Supreme Court has interpreted the First Amendment to include a separate standard for public figures versus private individuals?
And I was about to touch on that because the distinction that Attorney Rames is eloquently making is the distinction between a public figure and a private figure. Yeah. Because whereas the public is entitled to certain information, the distinction is made because as a public figure you have thrust yourself into the public sphere, and therefore you're held to a heightened standard by the courts. And that heightened standard is what we talk about, which is the actual malice standard, which Attorney Rames has already explained. And for a private person, the level of scrutiny is a little bit lower. And so if you write or publish an article in a newspaper against that defames or allegedly defames a private person, that person will have a slightly easier time of proving the defamation than if that person were a public figure. And what the court was saying in the both the Ethelyn Joseph case and the one you just mentioned is that the plaintiff must prove and meet your burden of showing that heightened standard of actual malice. And what That has come from his learned hand, which is one of our forefathers of our modern jurisprudence. He balances the harm within the society for the need for more speech, and then when you have a public figure, we require much more from the public figure than a private person per se.
Absolutely. And Attorney Henderson?
I think to piggyback on what Trudy just said, I believe that because it addresses the issue regarding public figures, it's speaking to the fact that as a community, we have a right to question those who are public officials. Yes. And if they were to have a lower standard to be able to sue people who might do these kinds of things, that it will then quell the public from being able to ask the questions they should be asking of their public officials. And so that distinction is there. But I think what's also important to note is that the New York Times versus Sullivan case was in 1964, at a time when the media was acting as a responsible media. And so in today's society, we have social media, we have people who have their online blogs or stories or whatever it is that they do and purport to be media. We have also, even in our print media, where people just aren't doing the kind of reporting and responsible reporting that they should be doing.
Well, let me ask you this then, and perhaps you can add, and Genevieve, I'd like to hear from you. Since you mentioned responsible reporting, traditionally, over time, the courts have recognized the media as the fourth estate, that fourth branch of government, quote unquote, that is not outlined necessarily in the Constitution, but for the First Amendment. Why is that, and how does the lack of responsibility, as you mentioned, diminish the press's role as the fourth estate?
I believe that it's there as a fourth to be the checks and balance on all three branches, and that the press is necessary. They're a necessary part of any democracy if we're going to thrive. A responsible press is necessary for our democracy to thrive, and so they need to be there so we're able as a community to question and to receive answers on how our democracy is moving forward. The responsibility factor is extremely important because I believe in today's society, even with an actual malice standard, it would be very easy to establish in reckless disregard for the truth or falsity. Because some people just aren't doing investigative reporting. They're just putting up a story and sending it out. And I believe it'll be much easier on suits on the reckless disregard of truth or falsity in an actual malice standard relative to the way that the press is reporting on public officials.
But let me ask this, and Genevieve, perhaps you can address this, because Attorney Henderson mentioned social media and blogs as a departure from the quote-unquote professional media. But isn't it a fact that the social media and the blogs and all of these non-traditional outlets are now being regarded as media that enjoy the same protections under the First Amendment? And what does this bring to the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge aspect of the conversation. Even when you think about employee-employer relationships, because even people have lost their jobs over what they post during work hours. But to bring it home to what Attorney Henderson stated, we're talking about persons becoming their own journalists. And we look at the last election where arguably, of course, false information was brought out to favor one candidate at the presidential level. But I will turn to also the fact that just recently in July of earlier this month, that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, in the case where Twitter users had basically sued for their rights against President Trump for him blocking their comments and being critical of him. And we had Judge Parker stating that it's a wide open, robust debate that generates a level of passion and integrity. And basically, it's exactly that. It's to generate that, but at the same time, balanced against. It's okay for us to be critical of our leaders. I will also couch it to also the same circuit court also, because Twitter users for the Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who many touts a lot of. She's a proponent of human rights, and she speaks openly about injustices. And she also faced criticism for the very fact that she was blocking critics of what she's expressed, and two polar opposites. And
so I guess
so arguably, when you look at it with these these two competing things. It's about also responsible citizens.
To a certain extent,
responsible
to
citizens.
To a certain extent, however, responsibility is sort of sometimes it's almost in the eye of the beholder, because the reason why why New York Times versus Sullivan was a case in the first place is because back in the civil rights movement, one of the greatest tools that Southern governments and Southern sheriffs had was the ability to bring libel cases against newspapers and reporters. Okay, and at the time, New York Times versus Sullivan was a 9-0 decision of the Supreme Court. By the time when that passed, there was almost $1/3 billion worth of libel lawsuits pending against newspapers and reporters as a result of their reporting on the civil rights movement. And so what New York Times versus Sullivan said is, no, just because you think that reporting on what's going on in Alabama, what's going on in Mississippi, what's going on in Georgia is somehow irresponsible, it is in the highest tradition of newspaper reporting to say what government is doing to people in this regard. And so you being a public figure, Mr. Alabama Sheriff, you have to prove that what that person is writing, he knows it to be false, or he's recklessly disregarding the truth.
And then to add to
Yes,
what you're
sure.
saying, Attorney Rames, the Pentagon Papers case, the
Yes.
other New York Times case, that is also a story in how do we balance what you think is responsible versus what I think is necessary in the public interest, because in that case, the government attempted to impose prior
Yeah.
restraint on the publication of information. So very good point. And what I'm interested in hearing what the other panelists think,
Sure.
because yes, the government may say, well, that's irresponsible. Does that mean that that defines whether or not citizens should actually get the information?
I think the restriction there has to do with safety. And if there is an issue that there is going to be a grave or irreparable harm to the government or to the body politic, that's when the restriction will come into place, right? So the balance there is, do we want more speech, or do we draw the line where that speech is going to, or the publication of certain documents will put the public and the government in grave and irreparable harm?
Right.
And before we continue, I just want to invite again the listening public to call. We're now open to take calls. You may call 340-718-3339. And I know I'm going to come back to you, Attorney Henderson, but I want to move it along because I want to take a look, since we're talking about the press and free speech, I want to take a look at one of the statements our president uses often. And one of the things he says is, I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposely negative and horrible and false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. Is that statement concerning?
Very. It is extremely concerning because what it says to me is I'm attempting to quell the rights of citizens who just don't agree with me or who just may not like me from ever being able to speak. And only if you like me and you say great things about me, then you're allowed to speak. That's a serious, serious issue. It is definitely something that our founding fathers did not and clearly did not want to have happened. It's the reason why we have this nation, because they did not have the kind of speech that they felt was free. And so that is a very, very concerning statement, because even as you read the quote, it doesn't speak to the kind of irresponsibility that should be protected. It sounds more of, as long as you don't agree with me, and as long as you don't like me, then we're going to open the libel laws to sue you.
But
that's
can
a
the
problem.
president open the libel
Of course
laws?
not.
I am not. I am concerned, but I also have trust and confidence in our court system, right? Because the president can say what the president desires, but ultimately our court has to stick with precedents. And we have these libel laws on the books for a reason. We had them in 1964 when we had the civil rights movement and those things happening.
And they're judicially made.
And
Right.
exactly.
Yeah, but go ahead. There is continuing danger, I think, to issues related to free speech. I think that with respect to what President Trump said, obviously, if you're a public figure or a public official, that is squarely within the realm of federal law and squarely within the confines of the rules of the rule of law that has been established by cases like New York Times versus Sullivan. However, if you're a private figure, okay, the law allows the individual states to ultimately make a determination as to how those libel laws or how the laws related to defamation are structured around private citizens. Now, the federal law says ultimately, yeah, individual states, you can go ahead and structure those laws for private citizens as long as you limit there has to be actual damages. If there's actual damages, then ultimately you can essentially you create those laws that establish libel laws for private citizens. Now, here in the U.S. Virgin Islands, there was a recent defamation case that where an employee of a company was fired for what the employer thought was theft. Okay, the employee decided that that employer was not being truthful, and that employer had defamed that employee. The jury essentially believed the plaintiff, and in that case, for defamation, for actual damages and consequential damages, and not consequential, but punitive damages, gave an award of over $1 million. This was just this past February. Gave an award of over $1 million to a person who was called a thief by her employer. So even in the United States Virgin Islands, if you're a private party and you're faced with a defamation lawsuit, the results on an individual business can be devastating. The results of of defaming a person, can be devastating as well. So I think that ultimately, when President Trump talks about changing the libel laws or opening up the libel laws, he can't do it, with respect to public figures or with respect to public officials. But there may be some loosening of laws that can be done with respect to private figures.
But how do you
again,
maintain?
Yes.
Yeah.
Anything absolute will create tyranny, right? And so I don't think the courts will go as far as to completely loosen, as we say, the libel laws, right? I'm not fully aware of the facts of that case, but as private citizens and businesses, we have to understand that there's an impact on people on their livelihood who are not in the same position as companies, so that if you fire someone or allegedly fire someone for theft, there are consequences.
Absolutely.
And the society within which we live understands the word theft has a very heavy weight and impact, and it's a very negative turn in the Caribbean setting,
but isn't
right?
truth the ultimate defense?
Truth is the defense.
Absolutely.
And
But
so-
establishing truth absolutely, that's very, very difficult to do in a courtroom context.
But before we continue, I
Yes.
want to remind our viewing audience that we are also streaming live on Facebook. If you would like to pose a question on Facebook, you may do so, or you may call 340-718-3339. And so, the panelists, how are the current socioeconomic political climate, how is that chipping away, perhaps, at the First Amendment? Where is
Huge
it?
way. We talk about the use of social media to drive change, to when you begin to expose things in government, corruption, because it is the hundreds of pages that were exposed of the governor of Puerto Rico as to what led, and so again, it was them communicating, using their free speech, and a lot of it insightful of violence and things of that nature. But ultimately, I look at it as a balance of ensuring the integrity of that space. So going back to the same circuit court of appeals in New York that again ruled against President Trump and is gearing up to examine what's going on with AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, representative of Congress. The attorney for the Twitter users, she expressed that it will help ensure the ruling the integrity and validity of our digital spaces that are increasingly important to our democracy. And I think that's key of what we've said in this panel. It's about that. I think too, we're also speaking about transparency in government, because even here in the Virgin Islands, there's a lot of struggles with information. So even we turn to, when we say free speech, it's also the desire for transparency and how that fits in. Because in many ways we have, unfortunately, a lot of cases where a lot of information is not shared with the public, and it's hidden someplace. It's in in this digital space. You would assume by now a lot of documents should be made available publicly.
This is perhaps a good segue.
Yeah.
I want to turn to, and we'll come back to this point, Attorney Rames, but I want to turn back to a couple of statements from some of our former presidents and look at it in the context of what is happening today.
Sure.
So in 2017, President George W. Bush said, "We need an independent media to hold people like me to account. Power can be very addictive and it can be corrosive, and it's important for the media to call to account people who abuse their power." That's from President George Bush. In January 2017, former President Barack Obama said, "I spent a lot of time in my farewell address talking about the state of our democracy. It goes without saying that essential to that is a free press." And then in 1962, December of 1962, we go to President John F. Kennedy, and about the press, he said, "The press is an invaluable arm of the presidency as a check on the administration. Even though we never like it, even though we wish they didn't write, and even though we disapprove, we couldn't do the job at all in a free society without a very active press." And so we have those statements, and these former presidents all underscore the importance of the media as a check on governmental power that must continue even when they endure bad media coverage.
I'm surprised that you didn't mention probably the most famous statement made by a president about the press, which is fake news.
Well, I'm going there right now. I'm going there. And so now you juxtapose that against the statement by our current president, and not one time, but multiple statements where he says the media is the enemy of the people.
Yes.
The media is fake news. So when we look at those statements, how do we juxtapose those quotes by Presidents Bush, Obama, and Kennedy with the sentiments expressed by President Trump as shown on the screen? And what does it mean for our democracy and the First Amendment?
It's very interesting. There is a media conglomerate out there. You know, the media is almost as stratified, politically as just politics is, as Democrats and Republicans are. I mean, when I travel around the country, there are places that I go where, in the public sphere, in airports, in bars and restaurants, you can't see anything but Fox News. They don't turn on anything but Fox News. And there are places in the northeast part of the United States where they won't turn on anything but CNN or MSNBC. I mean, it's almost as though we are placing ourselves into a situation here in America where we are listening to that news that essentially reflects who we believe we are, who we are as people, as opposed to trying to get objective or independent voices. And there are fewer and fewer objective and independent voices out there. And so when somebody like President Trump calls the media enemies of the people, or calls the media fake news, he's not talking about Roger Ailes. He's not talking about Sean Hannity. He's not talking about people of that ilk. He is talking about those people who are essentially on the other side of the spectrum. And there is a certain degree of dynamism in that. I mean, there's a certain degree of rivalry in that and dynamism in that. And I think taken together, it's a sort of a healthy environment. But if you only focus on one side or you only focus on the other, that is not a healthy environment.
So then, briefly, because I want to move to another issue, but I'd like to hear from the other panelists briefly.
I think that a lot of what we would know as press, what we would know as reporting, has been substituted for opinion opinion anchors. And so we have all of these shows, Hannity and all these different other types of shows, even Rachel Maddow, some other people, where their opinions is the entire hour or two,
Sure.
not necessarily their reporting. And so because we have now become into an age or in a society where we have substituted actual reporting for opinions, we lead to the kinds of comments that we hear our current president making, that there's fake news and there's all these other things, and the press is the enemy of the state, which is, I think, dangerous comments to make.
And we want to talk about that issue a little more, but Attorney Fenster, let me hear your thoughts.
I just had a slight nuance, and I thought, as we're sitting here, maybe the issue isn't really the freedom of the press, but curtailing presidential power. Because now we have one branch of government that is now guiding and skewing the second and the third, and then the fourth. So what is the question really about free press, or is the question about holding our president more
democracy
accountable
as a whole,
in light of saving our democracy and
Right.
maybe curtailing presidential power?
And,
so that was my
we
comment.
thank you. And we have Stephanie on the line, so I'm going to go to Stephanie with a question. Good evening, Stephanie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having a program such as this. I am taking notes. It is just so informative, but one of the things that really got me was your slides about the presidencies and just the presidents being able to use Twitter and just use social media. I know it was banned in the past. Do you think that helps or hurts them as a person and just them as a political figure?
Any of our panelists wanted to take that?
Well, when you say banned, you mean banned from a particular media platform?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah,
You know how
sure.
right now they're saying Trump should put his phone down and he shouldn't be allowed to tweet.
Yeah.
But he does have freedom of speech himself just
Well,
because
yeah.
he's a president.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that things like that, talking about banning people off of particular platforms or things of that nature, I think that's destructive to free speech. I think he should have an opportunity to be as boisterous as he wants to be, as long as he stays within the appropriate parameters of, say, the Brandenburg case, the test.
But Stephanie
Sure.
raises an interesting issue, and I'd like to hear from the other panelists, because does it make a difference that the president, she did mention that, but he has free speech as well, and she's correct, but does it change at all that he is the president and the ultimate public figure?
And my question, or my response to that will be, yes, it does change. Because are we at the point now where our own president presents a challenge and a danger to our democracy, such that the restriction on his free speech might be appropriate? I'm not advocating for that. I'm just putting it out there that because of the nature of his role as a public official.
So do we have a Brandenburg issue
We
from the
might.
president
I
of the
think
United
that
States?
someone should exercise judicial restraint on the president.
Yes.
Because it's one thing to have, and I believe the president still has his right to free speech as a general principle.
But it's not unfettered.
But it's not unfettered. When you're the president and you are privy to things that no one else really generally is privy to, and you're tweeting out things that's placing Americans and placing our military personnel in harm's way, those are the things I think where the courts should step in and say, Mr. President, you cannot do that.
So then we have a public interest issue.
Absolutely.
Exactly what the U.S. Supreme Court has previously recognized.
Absolutely.
And you do have now the Second Circuit saying Trump, or AOC, people can, essentially it's
can't
been
block
decided
them.
you cannot block them.
Yeah.
And so, and
Now, I
and,
want
and,
to touch
and-
on another
yeah.
issue, not to cut you off, but we're actually running short on time. And it's such an interesting discussion. It's a shame we don't have more time. But I'd like to touch on another related issue because, Genevieve, you mentioned earlier, that's the inundation of actual fake news being disseminated and consumed in social media. Now, we mentioned, of course, that President Trump likes to say, fake news, fake news, fake news, but there's actual fake news, as we recently learned from the Mueller report. And one of the things I want to go to now, if you look on your screen, is we recently had several poll results, primarily from the Pew Research Center. The Press Democrat also reported on that 68% of people say they get some news from social media, going back to what Attorney Henderson said, and 2 out of 5 get all of their news online. And this is significant. 86% of the people polled admitted that they have been duped by fake news stories online. 64% of adults say fake news cause confusion about events and about life, and 23% admitted that they have shared fake news. And I would venture to say that's probably even higher. So what do you think these polls tell us? And are we feeding into President Trump's assertions and allegations of fake news when in fact we have such an inundation of fake news?
I think we are at a crisis point in our democracy. And that is precisely because we have a branch of government, which is the legislative branch, which is not living up to its obligations, right? It has allowed one of the branches to go unfettered. And so there are legislative actions that can be taken that are not being taken for political reasons. And I think we're at a critical point in our democracy where we may have to step aside from politics and get into the business of protecting the American people and the integrity of our free society.
One of the things that we're noticing, I think, is that the levers of power, the balance of power in government it's very strong. You know, there are a lot of court cases that have pushed back against things that the president has done and have done that quite effectively. And you know, when you talk about fake news, I mean, the president of the United States essentially began his career with fake news, which is Barack Obama as a Kenyan. I mean, and that, you know, when you think about that, that's very insidious because it buys into people's racial hatreds and racial feelings about people. It buys into their feelings that the country is sort of leaving them behind and others are becoming more predominant in the country. And you see the impact of that on the southern border, where some horrible things are going on with respect to mothers and children and babies in the southern part of the United States, where you try to otherize people. You try to make them be the other. And I think that you know, to a certain extent, he decries fake news, but he's one of the most significant proponents of it.
And I think this is where why you see these numbers as well has to do with the citizenship and understanding of civics. Right here in the Virgin Islands, we are, when it comes to civic literacy, we're at a pretty low point in terms of how students graduating from school and having learned civics, because at the same time, through civic and education in that context, you would be more critical, you would be more interested in politics, you'd be more interested because it comes down to an election. It's that it took people, the same people who he's talking about the fake news, the same people who were responsible for electing him, and the same people who at the same time, if you look to some of the backgrounds of the persons who are promoting the president's agenda, and we look to their backgrounds in terms of what did they learn in school, what are they being taught, to a point where even in this very context of what is free speech, what is incitement, what is, in this case, even race being at the high point of what's going on in this country. So arguably, I personally believe that through more effective education, and at all times, right now it's a really good time for our students to become engaged in understanding the importance of being involved in government. And
I have to say the VI Bar Foundation has taken a lead in participating in the growth of our students. Just this year, we started a program where we have attorneys who volunteer to be teachers for the day, and we provide a program and territory-wide, and they're able to go in. But I want to ask this before we run out of time. What is the impact of real fake news on the apparent public push to discredit the traditional mainstream media?
Creation of more fake news. I see you create more fake news from, I mean, he's speaking of fake news, and even his statement is promotion of fake news.
But do we have the potential to further discredit the media and discourage citizens from consuming the real media if they believe that, well, we no longer know what to believe?
I think that we have, as a community, as a society, we have become extremely polarized. And so because we have become so polarized, we will then only listen to the information that we like to listen to, that fits our position of what we looked at. And that's why I keep going back to the importance of a responsible media and a responsible press, because their role isn't to be polarized. Their role is to be that checks and balance on our government and to be able to disseminate accurate information so that we are able as a community, members of the society, are able to get that information and process it and come to our own conclusions. But because we have become so polarized, our media has also become polarized because there needs to be ratings, there needs to be ads and money to be made, and so we become polarized. So if you're far right, then we all know what programs you listen to, and the stories that come there are going to be skewed to what you want, what you believe in. If you're on the far left, it is the same issue. It's just on the opposite end, and we don't have that neutrality.
A couple of things about that, just in brief. Clicks are money. Okay, I mean ultimately when you have your own social media site and people are clicking on that social media site, clicks turn into money if you put ads on that site. So ultimately, sometimes that pushes you into being more and more radical, going more and more further out on the edge, or doing stories that are more and more divisive. And I read yesterday that when incidents of hate speech get national news, incidents of hate action, incident of hate crimes actually is seen to have a bump up or have a slight increase. In fact, you can actually track that. You can track it with the most recent case of the people who was in North Carolina saying that one of the representatives, the one from Somalia, who is a naturalized United States citizen, tell her go back home. When that happened, then you saw incidents around the country where people were going out and saying these same things and parroting these same racist phrases.
So we're down to the last 2 minutes.
Sure.
I want to hear from Attorney Fenster.
So I think the term that we must always go back to is independent. Most of the presidents who have commented on why we need a free press is we need an independent free press. And just like we had the influx of money by the ruling Citizens United into the political races,
Sure.
the influx of ad clicking and increasing ratings and all of that somehow needs to be taken out or away from the media such that we can get back to the independent media that a democratic society relies upon. I don't know how we get there, but we need to start having that discussion.
Absolutely.
And thank you. And this is going to be a good place to wrap up. I think this has been a really good discussion, and I thank each and every one of our panelists for participating and for enriching the discussion. And I want to thank WTJX TV 12 for allowing us to present this to the community. And at this time, I'd like to ask the president of the Virgin Islands Bar Foundation, Attorney Trudy Fenster, to share a few words with us about the foundation.
I have to say I'm really quite impressed with the Virgin Islands Foundation and what it has been able to accomplish so far this year. When we started after the hurricanes, and we recognized that public education was paramount to our society. And so as part of our mission, we decided we were going to have committees dedicated to public education. And Attorney Velasquez is one of the chairpersons of that committee and has been doing an excellent job. The other aspect of the foundation, besides fundraising, is access to justice. We believe that for a society to thrive, all our people must have access to justice. So I thank all the panelists again, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to speak with our members of our society.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
WTJX, and good night, everyone. Please continue to join us for our future outreach programs. Thank you. Good night.
This program was underwritten in part by Bolt Nagy, attorneys at law, and viewers like you.